does religious belief dovetail with the moral landscape? Your ethical worldview is about minimizing suffering, maximizing well-being. There are a great deal of studies that show just empirically that religious communities and religious believers tend to do better on a lot of metrics. So one study recently that religious people coped better with the COVID pandemic, for example, and on metrics of feelings of worth and fulfillment and this kind of stuff, religious communities tend to perform better. If that's the case, and if you believe in an objective set of ethics which should value people's well-being, you wrote a book called The End of Faith, which attempted to dispel people of their religious beliefs. Should you not be pulling that from the shelves?
Yeah, well, so it's a big if whether or not religious communities actually do better. I mean, they do. Again, it all depends on what you mean by better in that case. But granting that they might, right? Then the question is that the best way to do that sort of better? Right? Is it actually required that you believe anything on insufficient evidence or live by one divisive dogma or another? Is that the only way to get to that high spot on the moral landscape? Right? And I think it's pretty clear that wouldn't be the case. I mean, I think it's just having a flexible conversation about reality that is responsive to changing argument and changing evidence and being intellectually honest and not being ruled by the confirmation biases of your Iron Age ancestors. I mean, all of this tends to be so good on so many questions of importance that I think just, having a more sophisticated, modern, and honest conversation about reality, even spiritual reality, and ethics, is going to be better in the long run. I mean, that's how I would place my bet. But it's totally possible that there are circumstances where being religious is an advantage, or still an advantage, when it would one day might not be an advantage, right?
I mean, it clearly evolved for some kind of beneficial reason. It wouldn't have cropped up in the mimetic landscape if it didn't serve some purpose. And maybe it's not serving that anymore, but
yeah, I'm not sure
it must do something, right?
I'm not sure about the evolutionary story here. I mean, the reasons to be skeptical of the whole notion of group selection, and even leaving that aside, you could say anything you say about religion, you could say about a belief in witchcraft, right? It's cultural universal. It's been around for as long as anyone can, imagine. It obviously it interacts rather often with religion, but it's this distinct strand of belief that most of us acknowledge is almost certainly bullshit, and yet you could tell a story about its utility, right? And I'm sure there are circumstances where belief in witchcraft has some pragmatic value for an individual, even for a whole society.
I mean, those communities still exist today. There are still people who will describe themselves as adherents of witchcraft, black magic, paganism, this kind of stuff, which many people view as these ancient, long-forgotten religious communities, but they still exist today, and I wonder if they coped better with the COVID pandemic as well. It's hard to know. But suppose that, we could establish this.
Sam Harris is right. There are several studies, as pointed out by Alex O'Connor, but they are inconclusive and based on self-report. As we're going to discuss, we cannot ignore it. We cannot ignore that self-report in religious research is imperative.
Welcome to The Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're diving into a question that sparked a lot of talk during the COVID-19 pandemic. Did religion actually, benefit people in those really tough times? Because a lot of the initial reports, the early studies, they certainly painted a very positive picture.
Yeah, they really did. And that initial picture, well, on the surface, it looked like a clear advantage for people of faith. But our mission today is really to pull back that curtain a bit. We're going to be sifting through quite a stack of sources, academic papers, some sharper critical analyses to really get at the nuances. And the contradictions, too. What did that positive impact actually mean? It's about getting the full story, which is often, pretty surprising.
Okay, so let's start with that main story, the prevailing narrative, because it really was everywhere for a while. Surveys, early studies, they often reported religious individuals seemed to cope better. You heard about lower stress, higher self-reported happiness, especially if faith was important to them. It almost seemed a bit too straightforward, didn't it? What were those initial findings really based on?
They were quite compelling, you're right. There was specific evidence coming out of the UK, for instance, studies using that big Understanding Society dataset, and also research from the University of Cambridge. And these indicated that, yeah, religious individuals saw smaller increases in unhappiness and stress during the lockdowns, 2020, 2021, smaller increases compared to their secular counterparts. And it wasn't just one group either. They saw this across different communities, Christians, Muslims, Hindus.
Okay, so pretty broad then.
Exactly. But here's a really crucial detail, one that sort of reshapes that initial view. It wasn't just being religious that mattered so much as the intensity, the commitment.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, studies show that people for whom religion made some or great difference in their lives, they experienced about half the increase in unhappiness, half compared to those who said it made little or no difference.
Well, that's significant.
It is. And this better coping, as it was called, it was always relative to the control groups, the non-religious folks, or those with low religiosity. It really seemed to make a difference when religion played an active, meaningful role, not just, ticking a box for affiliation.
Right. So it wasn't just a label. But okay, those findings are compelling. I get that.
Yeah.
But you hinted there's more to it. A deeper layer starts to come out when you look closer, right?
Yeah.
What might we be missing in just that initial assessment?
This is exactly where we need to put our critical thinking hats on. A lot of those early studies, they leaned really heavily on self-reported measures.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means they capture how people feel, their perceptions, not necessarily objective outcomes. So for instance, feeling resilient. That's not quite the same thing as actually being physically safer from catching COVID or immune to the real-world problems the pandemic caused.
Right, I see. Perception versus reality, potentially. And here's where it gets really interesting. There's this controversial idea, this hidden food metaphor. Can you explain that? It sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it's a striking analogy. Imagine like a hunger competition. But one group has secret access to snacks, hidden food. Then, surprise, surprise, they report feeling less hungry than the group following the rules.
Yep.
The suggestion here, controversially, was that maybe religious people reported better coping and less lockdown stress, partly because they weren't isolating as much. They might have continued social interactions, religious gatherings, effectively sidestepping some of the isolation rules. They had, in a way, this hidden access to connection.
The hidden food was social connection.
Exactly. That's one powerful way to frame it. And these hidden foods, these other factors contributing to that apparent resilience, there were a few key ones. First, like we said, reduced isolation. Staying plugged into a community, going to gatherings, even if risky, that provided a huge psychological buffer. That's very different from maybe more cautious folks or non-religious people who faced much more disruption and isolation.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, there's an element you could call obligatory happiness.
Obligatory happiness.
Yeah, cultural or spiritual norms within some religious communities can, maybe subtly, maybe not so subtly, encourage people to report being positive, to seem resilient. It makes you wonder, don't we all sometimes feel pressured to put on a brave face in our own circles?
That's true.
There was even this fascinating study. It showed that when people knew they were being prayed for, sometimes their anxiety actually increased.
Really? Why?
Likely because they felt this pressure, this expectation to appear spiritually strong, to show the prayers were working.
Wow, okay. That's counterintuitive.
Isn't it? And then finally, and this is maybe the most critical part, behavioral risk. The very act of, say, ignoring lockdown guidance to attend gatherings, even for comfort or faith reasons, that directly increased their exposure to COVID-19. It simply raised the physical risk for those individuals and potentially their communities.
So, okay, we're looking at this really complex picture now, this paradox. Faith might have genuinely offered comfort, meaning, purpose.
Absolutely. For many people, it clearly did.
But the reported advantage in well-being, that feeling better, it might have come at this hidden cost. Increased physical risk. That's quite a trade-off.
It's a very complex trade-off. And if you connect this back to the wider academic research, it gets even murkier. These studies on religion and resilience during the pandemic, they're not all saying the same thing. Sometimes they even contradict each other. Yeah, which suggests maybe some findings were just picking up on statistical noise, random variations in the data. Or maybe they were missing some really important variables. And this also brings up something called negative religious coping.
Negative religious coping. What's that?
It's things like feeling abandoned or punished by God, feeling spiritual discontent, anger towards God.
Okay, I see.
And here's a really surprising twist. while positive coping, like finding strength in faith, did offer some buffer. Another study found that negative religious coping, it was actually more strongly linked to increased COVID-19 anxiety than positive coping was linked to reducing it.
Wow. So feeling let down by your faith could be even more detrimental than feeling supported was beneficial.
That's what some research suggests, yeah. It highlights the potential downsides.
And it's also really important to remember, right, that any benefits people saw weren't necessarily universal. It wasn't the same for everyone.
Exactly. Not uniformly universal at all. There was a big meta-analysis that's basically a study of studies combining results to get a bigger picture.
Right.
It found that, yes, positive religious coping was generally linked to lower psychological symptoms, but that length varied quite a bit across different groups. The benefits weren't as consistently seen, for example, among younger people or among women in some studies.
So demographics matter too. It's not a one-size-fits-all effect.
Definitely not. And then there's another layer. Things like education, introspection, and how people report happiness. Populations with higher education levels often tend to be, well, more critically self-aware, they analyze things more, and paradoxically, that can sometimes lead to lower reported happiness because they might be more tuned in to their own internal struggles or societal problems.
Interesting.
Religious individuals, on the other hand, often benefit from what psychologists call a cognitive framing. It's like a unique way of thinking, a lens
Yeah.
that helps them interpret adversity, like a global pandemic, as potentially meaningful or at least manageable, rather than just purely chaotic or random.
Sort of finding purpose in hardship.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
And introspection, thinking deeply about things, which is sometimes encouraged by practices like prayer or meditation, that can help with coping. But again, the effects aren't uniform. And it doesn't come without potential psychological costs for some people. It's complex.
Okay, so given all these nuances, all these complexities, the self-reporting issues, the behavioral risks, the contradictions, how should we really frame our understanding of religion's role during the pandemic, looking back?
I think the deeper takeaway is this. Religion undoubtedly provided real emotional support, a sense of community, a sense of purpose for many, many people. That seems clear. But the evidence for it being a straightforward net benefit in terms of overall well-being during that specific crisis, it's far from simple. It's really tangled up with self-report bias, social expectations, cultural pressures, and critically, with behavioral risk.
Right, so that central paradox we talked about really stands out. Many religious individuals may genuinely have felt better, perhaps partly because their communities helped them avoid the crushing isolation others felt.
That social connection buffer.
But that very behavior, keeping those social connections going during lockdowns, might have simultaneously increased their actual physical exposure to the virus.
Precisely.
Emotional resilience is so valuable, we all want it. But it can be, well, maybe a bit deceptive if it comes at an unacknowledged cost of hidden physical risks.
Exactly, and that's why it's just crucial for all of us when we look at findings like these to approach them with a really critical, nuanced perspective. We have to recognize how complex the relationship between something like religion and mental health really is, and understand that how well any coping strategy works. It truly depends on a whole host of factors. It's never just one simple answer.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We really hope it encourages you, our listener, to always think critically, to look beyond the headlines and seemingly straightforward findings. And it leaves us with an important question, something for you to maybe mull over. How do our very natural, very human tendencies, seeking comfort, seeking connection, how do they sometimes, maybe inadvertently, lead us towards unseen risks? Not just in big health crises, but maybe even in our everyday decisions.